Hello friends, welcome back. I have another long essay planned for today, talking about the fantasy author Eva Reid. She is someone who started publishing in 2021 with The Wolf and the Woodsman and has published 4 books total since then: The Wolf and the Woodsman, Juniper and Thorn, A Study in Drowning, and Lady Macbeth. She has reached pretty big audiences. A couple of books have gone TikTok viral and has overall gained this reputation for writing these very dark, gothic, atmospheric fantasy books that focus a lot on feminism and the stories of women who are trauma survivors. And these are things that I really love in books and seek out a lot when I read. And I have loved the sound of almost all of Reid's premises, but I have just walked away from each of the reading experiences very dissatisfied and kind of confused and frustrated. So today I wanted to talk about why in my favorite format, which is an internet essay that is way too long. I want to make a couple of caveats before I get started. So the first thing is that Reid's protagonists are all trauma survivors, and I just want to be clear that different depictions of that are going to resonate for different people. It's very clear that there are people who have found meaning in their depictions of these things, and what I'm doing here is in no way meant to take away from whatever these books mean to others. This is just a topic that I am also very passionate about, and I spend a lot of time working on and thinking about. So my goal is just to share my thoughts about what works and doesn't work for me personally. Reid has also spoken about their experiences as a survivor and someone who struggles with mental health themselves, and that informing their writing. And I just ask that any conversations that come about because of this essay just are respectful of that. And respect those lived experiences and focus on their creative works alone. It's fine to have criticisms or thoughts about someone's artistic choices and depictions and how those work or don't work for you, but I'm not going to tolerate any kind of judgment extending to Reid or their own experiences. And then I just want to clarify that Reid's pronouns are she, they, so I will use both intermittently here. I wanted to start on a positive note and just be clear that there are things that I do like. There's kind of a core of things that I like about the books. At the most basic level, there is always a very strong sense of each protagonist's perspective as someone who is struggling really deeply. Kind of the way that I put it is like suffocating in her own mind and then filtering the world through that struggle. And I was once a girl who was very scared and unstable and struggling in that way. And so at that essential level, I really do believe these characters as girls who are experiencing those things, as women who are experiencing those things, and the way that Reid depicts that. And I also like some of the things that I've specifically seen the books criticized for, because I'm a bit of a contrarian when it comes to these things. For example, I spent a lot of time just kind of poking around reviews before writing this essay, and I saw a lot of complaints that the main characters in these books are like quote unquote annoying or difficult, especially with regards to Effie in A Study in Drowning and Avik in The Wolf and the Woodsman. There's been some criticism specifically of the fact that her sexual assault survivors have a sense of sexual agency. For example, Marlinchin in Juniper and Thorn masturbates, or there's the fact that after she is raped for the first time, Rosil in Lady Macbeth has sex with her love interest. Personally, I like that these depictions go against the grain of how we typically view survivors. I think they normalize responses that people, often women, are judged for, like for not being these proper, passive, pure victims, or having the quote-unquote normal responses that we expect of people and that are most tolerable for others. I think that the fact that people are saying there's something wrong with the characters for expressing their mental health struggles in a way that is annoying or inconvenient, or expressing their sexual agency, I think that says more about stigma and judgment than anything else. And that is just a very strange piece of all of this that I've seen unfold over time. So with that in mind, I want to be clear as well that my criticisms are not about whether I think Reid's characters are likable or whether they are realistic survivors to me. I'm generally of the mindset that characters mainly just need to be well drawn and interesting to spend time with and, be in the head of. And also that diverse trauma responses are all normal ways of dealing with the abnormal things that have happened to us. What I'm more interested in is kind of taking that step back and looking at the meta level, looking more at the skill of Reid's characterization and thematic work, as well as the implications of some of their writing choices around trauma and feminism. Probably most pressingly, I've thought a lot about Reid's methods of character development and their depictions of agency and trauma survivorhood, trauma recovery, working through trauma, those kinds of things. Each of her characters goes through some kind of empowerment arc through their trauma to some extent, and this development often happens very quickly at the end of the book in this kind of sudden revelatory way that does not feel very resonant or satisfying to me. And I also think that any of the more incremental character growth or explorations of agency we see throughout typically feel very muddled and confused to me. All of this, I think, is best shown in Lady Macbeth, which is the book that came out this year. It's a retelling of the Shakespeare play Macbeth that casts Lady Macbeth as Rosil, who is a French teenager and an unwilling bride to Macbeth. She basically has to use her intelligence to try to carve out a space for herself in this violent world of the patriarchy, while generally following the beats of the original play. Rosil is also famously beautiful, kind of notoriously beautiful, and she has to wear a veil because people believe that if men look into her eyes, they will go crazy and fall under her complete control. It turns out that this is actually true, and then she sometimes uses this power throughout the book too, such as when she kills the King of Scotland at Macbeth's command. One of the main things that Rosil does throughout is attempt a variety of these sort of machinations or plots to gain power in her new home and to avoid consummating her marriage. A lot of the reviews that I've seen of the book go into depth about how, these plots of hers are very nonsensical. They don't make a lot of sense when you actually think about the implications of what she's trying to do. And I do agree with that, but that's not really my main concern. I'm more interested in how she sort of vacillates throughout the book between being very passive and then using her agency on different occasions. I think at this point, I want to be careful with it because, especially regarding her not using her magic to control people like Macbeth and protect herself, I think that could veer into this kind of dangerous territory of victim blaming, well, why didn't she just control Macbeth? Why didn't she use her magic on him? Why didn't she stop him from doing XYZ? I think it's important to kind of have a little bit of compassion and remember that this character is a young girl in an unwanted marriage in a strange land, and there are very real psychological barriers that can prevent someone from taking steps in a situation like that might feel obvious to someone looking in from the outside. What complicates that for me, though, is that we do see plenty of occasions where she is actively plotting and resisting and using her magic to get men to do what she wants. And while it could also absolutely make sense for a character like this to fluctuate in her ability to resist or to sometimes feel limited in what she can do because of the force of her oppression, the issue for me is that I don't really see any internal consistency or any psychological exploration regarding any of this in Lady Macbeth. I was taking notes as I was reading, and I was really trying to understand, what internally determines when Rosil acts and when she does not. And I just kind of feel at the end of the day like the story spends very little time thinking about the complexities of that, and it doesn't really feel that interested in doing so at all. It just kind of leaves me feeling that the instances when she's more passive or when she acts and plots and uses her agency feel kind of arbitrary and determined by what is necessary for the plot, like killing the king because Macbeth tells her to, trying to assassinate Lysander because Macbeth tells her to, so that the dynamic of her relationship with Lysander can change, things like that. I just don't see any really effective character work to show anything to the contrary, like in her state of mind or her decision making or her development. And so the result of this is that, as I said, you do get the strong sense of Rosil as someone who is very, oppressed and scared and struggling in that sense, but otherwise she feels very vague and kind of incoherent as a character, and any explorations of like resistance and female agency in this traumatic patriarchy ends up feeling very vague and kind of befuddled as well. The other thing that convinces me that this is just not the best writing is that Rosil is also lacking in a lot of depth and kind of internal consistency in a lot of other ways. There's times where she will feel very guilty about her actions and think about, the violence that has been committed because of her and things like that. But there are big gaps in the things that she thinks about when she's thinking about these things. For example, there's a point in time where she's feeling very guilty about being responsible for people's deaths, and she thinks about this stable boy who died because she kissed him and then her father killed him, but she doesn't think about the big number of people who just died in this campaign that she convinced Macbeth to wage very recently against another clan. Like when he is gone on that raid, she starts panicking because she realizes if he dies, she will basically become war spoils. And she's very upset about this, understandably, but then in the scene where the war party returns and she's looking for Macbeth, this just doesn't register at all as she's looking for him and thinking about him returning. There's one point in time where she tries to complete suicide by throwing herself off the castle roof, and then her love interest, Lysander, who I mentioned before, saves her. And then there's only just this one brief passing mention of suicidality on one other occasion, at least that I caught after that. And so I think the sum of all of this just feels very strange and disjointed to me. But what I think is most disappointing is not these oscillations and the sort of lack of depth throughout, but the main thing for me is that her big female power breakthrough moment happens at the 94% mark in the book. I did go back and check in my ebook, and it's 94%. Basically, while she's become imprisoned in Macbeth's dungeon, she suddenly has this massive epiphany that, she's this complex, powerful woman who contains multitudes, and her power cannot be constrained by Macbeth and the patriarchy. She kind of decides exactly what she needs to do to regain her freedom and escape, and then she very quickly kills Macbeth and becomes Lysander's queen. And to be clear, I don't think that huge breakthroughs are impossible, but I also just don't think that they're the most narratively interesting option most of the time, or the choice that will be most interesting or resonant for readers who are looking for very character development driven narratives or grounded explorations of trauma. At least in my case, what I really value stories that show, that gradual growth and the setbacks that come in a way that feels very psychologically coherent, instead of these sudden empowerment moments and climaxes that leave out how messy and interesting and gradual these things often are. The same general trajectory happens in A Study in Drowning with Effie. So she is a character who struggles very intensely throughout the book as well, and her main sort of vector of growth that happens is pretty limited, but it is through her romance with another character named Preston. And when she realizes then at the very end of the book that the Fairy King is real and she has, not been hallucinating this whole time, she defeats him at the end of the book, and this kind of serves as the moment of major character growth and insight and healing for her that leaves her, in a much happier place by the end. I will say I think this is less the case in Juniper and Thorn and The Wolf and the Woodsman, but especially in Lady Macbeth and A Study in Drowning, just these kind of giant revelations at the end after kind of just muddling along through most of the book just feels very disappointing to me. And what I want to do as I go through is provide examples of books that I think succeed in kind of each of the areas that I talk about and I'm providing criticism for here. So when I'm thinking specifically about like a character experiencing these ups and downs and this like a very, very realistic, interesting struggle for agency in a situation like this, a book that I would really recommend is The Pattern Scars by Caitlin Sweet. It looks very closely at a young woman's experiences of like her helplessness, despair, her resistance, and her kind of battle for agency while she is magically bound to her abusive master's control and his use of prophecy and necromancy to do various horrible things. And I think that, you know, everything that I wish for in Lucille's character exploration and her character arc is present here. And what I just think is it's very powerful, but it's also very nuanced and subtle exploration of her struggles and her motivations and just her very rich, complex inner world as the protagonist in The Pattern Scars tries to survive this situation of very intense oppression and violence. And because I've read this book, I know that it can be done, and it can be done very well. I would also say that the trilogies following Fitzchivalry Farseer and Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings, there's a bunch of fantasy series within the overall setting of the Realm of the Elderlings, also does this really well. There's a big focus on characters' trauma and growth and struggles over decades of their lives. Hobb is really known for characters who feel incredibly real in their psychology and their inner worlds and how they respond to some of the incredibly painful things that they go through, especially as characters like Fitz are controlled and powerless in many regards. So that is another example of a book that I think does this aspect very well. I already touched on this a bit, but I wanted to spend some more time focusing specifically on the means by which the protagonists in these books primarily experience whatever, you know, empowerment and growth and healing they experience. Specifically, the male love interest is almost always the primary means of any of this positive growth, and he is usually the only significant character in the book who is not really horrible to the protagonist. If there are any relationships between female characters, they are usually pretty minor or they're overwhelmingly negative throughout. And then any female relationships intended to be positive or to show feminist sisterhood only happen very rapidly at the end of the book. So in Lady Macbeth, I mentioned Lysander is Lucille's love interest, and he pretty much instantly just starts giving her these little like feminist pep talks, despite knowing that she just murdered his father and also attempted to murder him too. So an example that I pulled, he says, "All your life you have been muzzled, so as not to disturb the architecture of the world. They may rob your body of its power, but they cannot take your mind." And so this is a very consistent dynamic throughout the book. While every other man is very violent and abusive and sexist, Lysander is this source of comfort and you know, these feminist messages that she isn't really getting anywhere else in her life. There are also very inexplicably no other women in Macbeth's castle, that is not an assumption on my part. That is directly stated in the text. Until Lucille gets a servant to replace the one who was killed at the start, they bond at the very end of the book, and Lucille fights to protect her. And Lucille joins her power with the witches in the story, who in this version are Macbeth's former wives, who have been imprisoned in his dungeon so that they can basically use their magic and their prophecies for him. And at the very end of the book, she is down imprisoned with them and joins her power with them so they can all break free. But again, that happens at the very end of the book, very, very quickly. It's very similar in A Study in Drowning. Effie specifically reflects that her relationship with Preston, her love interest, is what brings her strength and helps her heal, while every other man in the book is just a piece of shit. You know, there are men who have assaulted her or just been very sexist and objectifying to her or very patronizing. At the very end, she frees a woman named Angharad from her control by the Fairy King and helps her reclaim her voice as the true author of these classic beloved books, a book that she loves. And this was really my favorite part of the story, but again, it just happened very, very quickly and briefly at the end of the book. And then in Juniper and Thorn, Marlinchen and her two sisters are entrapped and abused by their sorcerer father. They're forced to use their magic to make him money. They're rarely allowed to leave the house, and they're made to kind of just bend to his temper and his whims. But the sisters' roles in the story never go beyond those of your sort of stereotypical nasty fairy tale sisters. They insult and patronize and bully Marlinchen. They show how much worse she is treated by their father, and they keep her excluded from their secret rebellions against him because they think that she is stupid. One ends up getting killed, and the other just kind of ends the book begging Marlinchen for forgiveness. And again, her sort of secret romance with this ballet dancer named Savas is the primary means by which she starts to find her agency and push against the constraints that have been placed on her for so long. And then in The Wolf and the Woodsman, again, the main relationship with depth and growth is between Evik and the woodsman / Prince Gaspar, although some of her development also comes from her relationship with her father. But she has endured this lifetime of abuse from her adopted mother and has been the victim of this really horrible, vicious bullying by the other village girls. However, then at the end of the book, she joins up with the main bully, Catalan, to defeat the book's villain. So I hope it's clear that there is a really strong pattern here, and I also hope it's clear how much more each of these stories could be doing. It is just very disappointing to me that each of these books, paying lip service to this goal of feminist empowerment for trauma survivors, what they're doing is they're focusing primarily on a woman's romantic relationship with the one good man in the story, to the detriment of actually, really meaningfully developing these feminist ideas from scratch, or developing solidarity with other women, or exploring, all these very interesting, complex ways that empowerment and healing can start to happen. And then my recommendation for this section, for a book that shows a group of women who gradually come together against their collective abuse in a really powerful way, and that also explores their individual trauma responses and their individual means of survival and empowerment. I really recommend Neandel by Maria Turchaninov. And then for a book that shows a group of women kind of gradually coming together against their collective abuse and oppression in a really powerful way, as well as showing their individual trauma responses and their means of survival, I recommend Neandel by Maria Turchaninov. This is technically the second book in a trilogy, and the whole trilogy, I like the whole trilogy a lot, but that book in particular, Neandel, definitely fits the bill for what I hope for in this kind of story. Okay, I turned on a light because I realized I was just sitting in the dark talking to myself. My next point, though, is that I am also really frustrated when I see these books described as ones that have a lot to say about feminism and the patriarchy, and they are described this way almost every time I hear something about them. I have already described my problems with the lack of character development throughout and kind of the ineffectiveness of how I see agency being explored, this lack of complex female relationships, the focus on male love interests to the detriment of all else, and this propensity to have all of the male characters except for the love interest be these violent, misogynistic brutes. In addition to all of those problems tied to the book's depictions of feminism, I just don't feel like they have an extraordinary amount to say. We repeat the theme in each book of men somehow exploiting and disempowering women by stealing their magic or their voices, so a central idea is always reclaiming those. And through this comes the idea that men's power is built upon taking away women's by methods that are abusive to them, so feminist action and trauma healing have to combine to involve reclamation. And that is fine as far as it goes. I think that's perfectly solid, but I just think when you put that message together with the sort of lack of everything else going on, I can't help but want more. And beyond the central idea that gets explored each time and the fact that each female protagonist struggles to kind of believe herself in the process of doing so, there are also these very kind of basic explicit statements about the nature of men and masculinity being inherently violent and cruel and selfish. This happens especially throughout Lady Macbeth. One quote that I picked says, "The nature of man is not such that it can be undone entirely by simple affection for a woman. The king still had a man's desires, his hungers, and his vices," which then goes on to explain why he raped another woman. So I'm not one who, goes around yelling about like hashtag not all men by any means. That's not where I'm coming from at all. But I do think that this kind of statement is pretty basic. I think it's pretty boring. And I'm not really interested in the more like rad femme notion of this inherently violent masculine nature, which I think some of these statements, not all, but some of them kind of stray a bit towards, instead of, making the argument that I most align with, which is, that the influences of patriarchal masculinity are damaging and widespread, but not inherently baked into anybody's nature. And so, yeah, in any case, with both of these, I'm just looking for a lot more from an author who is regularly acclaimed for their use of feminist themes and exploring the patriarchy in their works. What I also find very frustrating is that I can see exactly how each book could easily have done so much more in this regard. So Lady Macbeth has gotten a lot of hate for its take on the play, basically turning this iconic villainous character who is like the ultimate evil girl boss queen into a disempowered teenage girl who is struggling with abuse. I personally am less bothered by this choice than most. Like, I don't believe that it's automatically anti-feminist to write a story about a disempowered woman, or a woman who is raped, or a woman who struggles in a patriarchal world. This is an opinion that I see and am told very often, and I talk about my thoughts regarding it in an essay that I will link below. I also think that retellings and reimaginings can be different from their original inspirations. I'm okay with that. And it probably also helps that I'm not someone who has like especially strong ties to the original play. But I just think that you have to actually do something interesting to pull these choices off, either by having something to say other than patriarchy bad, or, by exploring the complexities of survivorhood with a character who feels real and dynamic and complex in some regard. Or, maybe doing both of those things, or that and more. What is really, really wasted here to me is any exploration of the discrepancy between Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth and Reid's. I just feel like instantaneously there's this space for something really fascinating in Rosil being this terrified girl who was clawing for survival, who effectively gains safety and agency, and is then like villainized in her legacy as being this, callous ball-busting monster who controls her husband to gain power. I just feel like that's an interesting discrepancy between the two stories that you could really do some work with. And it just feels like such a missed opportunity not to explore that at all. I'm also really confused by how little thought there is surrounding the premise with Lady Macbeth's Rosil's magic, and the messaging around it. This concept of a woman so beautiful that she makes men go crazy and then they fall into her power. I feel like it leads very clearly into an exploration of victim blaming, like, oh, you're so beautiful, you make me crazy, look what you made me do. And also this like very evergreen idea that women are actually the ones in control in the patriarchy because of how they manipulate men's desire and love for them. The idea that they secretly have men wrapped around their little fingers so they have more control than feminists would say. I just feel like all of that is so rich and ready for exploration, but the book just does not seem interested in exploring any of that at all, which, yeah, it's frustrating to me, because I feel like it could be saying so much more even with just a little bit more focus on any of those ideas. I also think a lot about the missed opportunities in Juniper and Thorn in this regard as well. So, going back to what I was saying about the sisters being divided and why, I think that these stories with complex relationships between women are so important to feminist work. If this story had been more focused on Marlon Chin's relationship with her sisters, it could have spent time grappling with how control and abuse turn women against each other as they try to survive. But then, this division ultimately just perpetuates our powerlessness. So if the sisters had worked to come to terms with how they competed with and hurt one another as they struggled not to be hurt by their father, if they realized who the real monster was and that the only way to freedom was by joining together, despite the complexities of their past and how they'd hurt each other, trying to find a new way through that, I think that my feelings about the book would have been completely different. As it is now, I will just point to a few examples of books that I do think explore this theme of complex sister relationships under abuse more effectively. One is The Onion Girl by Charles DeLint, which I think is a little bit aged in some regards, but in this particular aspect of the relationship between the sisters, I still think it's very interesting. And I didn't absolutely love, and I do have some criticisms regarding the depiction of feminism in The Once and Future Witches by Alex E. Harrow, but I did like how it explored the three main sisters in the book kind of grappling through this and coming together in this regard. And this is one minor element of the book Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik, and I believe it's a sister and her brothers in this case, but I absolutely loved how this kind of process was depicted there too. And then to return to the main idea of this section with my recommendations, the book Tahanu by Ursula Le Guin is one that I talk about it all the time, and it just will forever be my recommendation for fantasy that explores trauma and patriarchy and power, and just basically how can we even begin to think about transforming any of these massive things in ways that I just personally I find awe-inspiring and just beautiful and profound and incredibly moving. So my next section deviates a little bit from the rest, the sort of path that I've been doing of exploring these themes of empowerment, feminism, trauma, but I realized I still have more to say, and I just kind of wanted to include these as well. I think they tie in enough. First point is that I just really fundamentally do not like how Reid writes her romances. I already mentioned this centrality of the romances to growth that I think could be happening in much more interesting and meaningful ways. But I also think that the relationships tend to develop very quickly, and there is often an element of enemies to lovers or rivals to lovers that usually just does not work for me. In A Study in Drowning and The Wolf and the Woodsman, the couples spend most of their books together, but they spend most of that time arguing, and then the transition to the lovers part of the relationship just does not feel very convincing to me. And then in Juniper and Thorn and Lady Macbeth, the couples' interactions are very brief and limited throughout, but they end up with these very passionate relationships and these very intense love declarations anyway. My least favorite romance is probably between Effie and Preston in A Study in Drowning, which I talked a lot about in my just regular book review of that. So I just decided that I would kind of copy and paste that here. So I said in the first third or so of A Study in Drowning, Effie is just very petty and spiteful and rude to Preston because he represents everything that she is being denied at college due to sexism. He is in the department that she wants to be in and can't be in because she's a girl. And Preston just kind of takes this. Effie also makes a lot of very prejudiced, stereotype statements about him being from the country that her country is currently at war with. And I always want to be clear when I talk about this that my problem is not that this happens. I think it's fine to write a story where a character who has been through a lot lashes out at someone who it's safe to lash out at, or isn't always 100% perfect in a relationship. I think where it fails to work for me, though, is the way that it just kind of doesn't explore any of this very in depth and just kind of awkwardly transitions from this pettiness and sniping and arguing to what is supposed to be this very delicate, tender, respectful romance that is all about like being sensitive of trauma and empowering and supporting Effie. And so Effie apologizes to Preston eventually, but it just feels very much like too little too late, because the relationship has kind of already moved past that point. And it's a little bit funny how it's written. She kind of just is like, I'm sorry that I was so unkind to you without knowing you at all, and just, made all these stereotypes in the most uncharitable way possible. And like, I guess that was kind of awful of me. And his response is very much like, no, like, I wish that you could see yourself the way that I see you, because you were just challenging me intellectually. And it's like, no, that's not really what was happening. And he's very understanding of the fact that she's been through what she's been through, and that she's been stereotyped too as a girl at college. I just feel like that element of Effie's own prejudice is never really meaningfully unpacked, and I think it could be a great chance to have a look at someone struggling with their own oppression, their own hurt, how they can still judge and hurt others in similar ways, and maybe even do so because of how they're being hurt. But it just doesn't ever quite go there. And then again, like I said, it shifts gears into this very, it's just supposed to be so delicate and tender and supportive after this very, rocky, strange beginning. Another problem for me that is true of Preston, and the other love interest that I'll talk about later, is that he feels very bland and lifeless to me. I just never really felt like I got a true sense of what made him distinct or complex or interesting as a character. Like, we know he is he's cynical, he loves talking about his academic theories, and he's very kind and respectful to Effie, when every other man in the book is this lascivious slobbering monster. And there's one really lovely scene where they have a conversation about his father's death, which I liked, but I feel like that's kind of the most significant spotlight moment that he gets throughout. So that's what I said in my review of A Study in Drowning. But I think that the issues that I mentioned here kind of thread together in the other books' romances too. This problem that, to me, the love interests are often very vague and boring. Like, we hear a lot about their cheekbones and their angular bodies and how broody they are, and there's always this fact that to some extent they are outsiders in the world as well, but I just don't find them super well developed or interesting beyond that. The books have no real interest in exploring the implications of the female character ever treating their partners badly in any way. I don't think that's really super relevant in Juniper and Thorn at all, but I think there could be more exploration of that could be really interesting in the other books that just I don't really see happening. And then the fact that the pacing is very quick, leading into these very passionate feelings, which makes things feel kind of undeveloped and inauthentic to me. And I think when I look at all of this together, and when I was kind of putting all of it together for this essay, I think, combine that as well with the fact that the male characters are usually these, only good men in the story, and the main method by which the protagonists are empowered, I feel like a lot of what doesn't work for me essentially comes down to the fact that Reid struggles to write these straight male-female romances in stories that are also focused on sexism and patriarchal violence, while kind of reconciling the messiness of doing so and the nuances of power and gender in these relationships that could make these romances really powerful and really healing in these contexts. And I feel confident in saying that because I love a good romance like this. It's my favorite type of romance is, something that incorporates those elements of trauma healing and that yearning and tenderness and growth together and things like that. It's my favorite type of romance. So my go-to recommendations for that type of story, I feel like I mention these everywhere anytime anyone asks for a fantasy romance, but I love Empire of Sand and Realm of Ash by Tasha Suri. I also love almost anything by Juliette Marillier, but I think her Beauty and the Beast retelling Heart's Blood is really good in this regard as well. And then I just have to mention one non-fantasy recommendation I think might be my favorite romance in any book of all time, which is in a book called The Raging Quiet by Cheryl Jordan. It is this very small-scale, kind of forgotten gem of a historical young adult book that I just think is so beautiful and just tender and kind that I want to just I'm gonna cry thinking about it. It's really, really lovely. And so then, also having read all of Reid's published books as of 2024, something else that I just felt the need to mention is that there's always something very wild happening in her plots. I want to be clear, like, I'm not someone who needs something to be very tightly paced with a perfect 3-act structure following the traditional hero's journey or anything like that. Like, I'm pretty much along for the ride as long as there's something interesting going on, but I do need what I'm reading to be interesting, and I need it to make some kind of internal sense in the story, which I do feel can be hit or miss in some of Reid's plots. There are these strange choices in each book, but this really stood out to me the most in A Study in Drowning. So the premise is that Effie wins this contest to redesign the historical manor house of a famous author, but then she really doesn't do that at all while she's there. She's off investigating these other things. But what's strange is that she never seems to think about the fact that her employer does not care, that she's just kind of running around doing other things and making very little progress on her work. And this is ultimately revealed to be because it is this very like convoluted entrapment scheme devised by the Fairy King to make Effie kind of become his because he's obsessed with her. So that explains why it's happening in the story, but it doesn't necessarily explain why Effie doesn't ever think about it as something that's strange. And then there's the fact that there is this kind of strange scheme on the part of the Fairy King to devise an architecture competition to trap Effie. And then there's this one single climactic scene that's, well, it's quite anticlimactic, I think, where she just tricks him into looking into a shard of mirror and then defeats him completely that way. Doing that, she frees the character I mentioned, Angharad, who was kind of hiding throughout their stay at the house. And there are these reasons given that she has to kind of stay in the background and try to manage the Fairy King without enlisting the help of any outsiders or without warning Effie about what was happening. But I just felt, without going into all of it, that those reasons just were a little bit half-baked. And then the other thing that I can't go without mentioning is that she and Preston decide to have sex for the first time, and then they just kind of leisurely like nap and spoon in the manor's guest house while there is this very creepy, ominous man like wandering around and threatening them in the main house. And there is a massive storm about to hit and wash away the roads, which will trap them there, with this dangerous man who they're like, yeah, there's something going on here, like we're not safe. And so this is the time that they choose to just have sex and then like lie around all cozy together, which it's so strange to me. And then there's other elements, like she finds this very important letter that reveals a ton of information and was written decades ago, just randomly lying under someone's bed while she and Preston are poking around a stranger's house. Yeah, there's just a lot of things like this that add up throughout each of the books. Most of The Wolf and the Woodsman is just a cycle of Evik and Gaspar having the same exact arguments over and over, and then they get attacked by some mythological creatures in a way that brings them closer together, and this all happens on this fetch quest that proves futile, and the villains just make these very bafflingly bad choices all the time. A lot of the stuff that I would draw attention to in Lady Macbeth has been explored in others' reviews, like specifically around how a lot of her plotting and machinations don't make that much sense. I also think there's this element of other characters in the book, like Lysander and Macbeth, making decisions and fluctuating in their characterization and their motives in these very plot contingent ways, in addition to how Rasil does that too. So basically, I don't know, just I will love a vibes heavy kind of plot light book as much as the next person, but I do feel that whatever plot does exist still needs to be able to stand up to that basic level of scrutiny. And I think any time that I spend thinking about the sort of structuring and the narrative logic of these stories, things don't always stand up super well to me. And so my last point might be my most controversial point, because regardless of how thoroughly a review criticizes Reid's books, there's almost always this sort of grudging line or two dedicated to the fact that her prose is very beautiful and the books are very atmospheric. Like, you love the vibes, you love the atmosphere that's there. So of course, this is as subjective as any of the other elements I've discussed so far, but I'm just less inclined to praise Reid's writing. I find it to be distractingly repetitive, not only the blushing that happens almost every single page, but I also feel like there is just this over-reliance on certain turns of phrases and pieces of imagery, and these slightly like off-kilter similes and metaphors in each book. Something that I hadn't been able to really put my finger on before all of the reading and rereading that I did for this essay is the fact that her writing feels just like somehow like vague or opaque or cloudy to me in a way that feels very flat instead of sort of impressionistic and dreamy, as I think it might be intended to be when it is combined with these plots and themes and relationships and characters that I also find very lacking. I am someone who loves poetic prose and lush atmosphere and lots of vibes in my fantasy, and so I do have a lot of recommendations for this one for readers who are looking for those things in combination with explorations of trauma and the sort of dark fairy tale-esque elements. I will always recommend Patricia McKillop for these things, especially the Forgotten Beasts of Eld and Winter Rose, for the explorations of trauma and the kind of darker themes. Tanith Lee, especially White as Snow, probably with the caveat that also goes for the pattern scars that I mentioned earlier, that I would not necessarily describe the ending of the books as happy. In the Night Garden by Catherine Valenti, which I believe was a comp title for Juniper and Thorn, Deerskin by Robin McKinley, and Tender Morsels by Margot Lanigan. Those are some of my favorite books that I think just have truly beautiful writing, very, very rich atmospheres and aesthetics, while also combining these explorations of trauma, these sort of fairy tale themes and stories within stories and all of that. Just all of the things that I love in a fantasy read like that I think do them really well. And yeah, that's pretty much what I have today. As I said at the start, I completely understand why readers are drawn to read stories, and I completely understand why what they're writing works for some people and just doesn't work for me. I think it's because I am also so drawn to her promise that I have thought so much about these books and find them so frustrating instead of just dismissing them as I usually do with most of my reading disappointments. I hope that I kind of articulated what I find lacking in their delivery of these strong premises, and I just hope that some of the books that I suggested prove to be good reading for anyone who has been disappointed like I have, or for fans who are looking to kind of scratch that same itch. You can like and subscribe here if you want. I am trying to post things a little bit more often, but it happens when it happens. On my author website, you can follow me as I review books regularly, especially speculative fiction focused on trauma in this big project that I'm working on. I actually recently decided to delist my fantasy trilogy, but you can check out my book that is in print. It's called When We Walked in Memory. That features a lot of these things that I've talked about here, and that I love in these types of books. I didn't want to like include it as something that you should read instead because that just felt like deeply embarrassing, and I was just like, no, I'm not doing that. But I will say that these are things that I think a lot about and try to incorporate in as best as I could into that book. You can find me on the social media that is linked on my author website, but at this point, all I really do is reblog Dragon Age fan art on Tumblr, so please, follow me on Tumblr if you want in on some of that action. And yeah, I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. Whatever thoughts you have, I'm eager to hear below. Thank you for watching, and take care.